When Mark, the CEO of an RV dealership, goes undercover to uncover hidden corruption, he's stunned by what he hears. An elderly couple being scammed right in front of him. Will he expose the truth and change the system? Stay tuned to find out, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more. Mark had spent years building his dealership from the ground up. What started as a small operation with a handful of cars had blossomed into a thriving multi-state business. Known for its high standards and excellent customer service, Mark's dealership had become a trusted name in the industry. He was proud of how far he'd come, but recently, something began to feel off. Customer complaints had been flooding in. Hidden fees, unnecessary add-ons, high-pressure sales tactics. It was becoming a pattern. Reports from his management team painted a rosy picture, showing positive sales numbers. But when Mark spoke with customers, the complaints were real, and they didn't match up with the numbers on his desk. Mark had long trusted his team, but now, the corporate reports seemed more like rehearsed stories than true reflections of the dealership's operations. Deep down, Mark knew he had to see for himself what was happening behind the scenes. He couldn't let another day go by without uncovering the truth. So, Mark decided to go undercover, disguised as a regular customer, hoping to experience the sales process firsthand and expose any corruption that might exist. He shaved off his neatly kept beard, swapped his tailored suit for an old polo and khakis, and donned thick-rimmed glasses. His new name, Mike, a name he had never used, allowing him to blend in without raising suspicion. The next morning, Mark walked into the dealership as Mike, his heart pounding. He immediately noticed the frantic energy in the air. Salespeople were rushing around, approaching customers with urgency, eager to make a deal. It wasn't the usual welcoming atmosphere he had worked so hard to cultivate. It was pressure, a feeling of desperation. As he wandered through the showroom, he overheard one conversation that made his stomach twist. An elderly couple stood near one of the RVs, discussing the vehicle they were interested in. The husband was trying to reassure his wife, but there was clear hesitation in her voice. "I don't understand all these extra charges," she said, holding the price sheet. "Why are they adding all these fees? Paint protection, for instance. Why is that an extra cost?" Her husband, appearing somewhat unsure himself, shrugged. "I don't know, but we've been looking for an RV for months. This one seems perfect. It's probably just something they do here, right?" Mark, still posing as a regular customer, observed the interaction from a distance. The salesman was leaning in, speaking rapidly, and pushing the couple toward a decision. The elderly woman seemed confused, but she was being persuaded to sign the deal, despite her discomfort with the charges. Mark felt a wave of anger. This wasn't right. The elderly couple didn't seem to understand the fees that were being added to the base price of the RV. Fees for things like paint protection, extended warranties, and other add-ons. These were unnecessary costs, designed to inflate the final price and boost the dealership's profits. The salesman, seemingly ignoring the couple's hesitation, continued with his pitch. Mark could see how the couple was being manipulated. The husband looked increasingly unsure, while the wife seemed ready to agree to the additional costs just to avoid further conflict. It was clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. The dealership's corruption was systemic. They were preying on vulnerable customers, like this elderly couple, who were confused by the sales tactics and unfamiliar with the extra charges. Mark knew he had to gather more information. He wasn't just going to stand by and watch customers be mistreated. The time for subtlety was over. He had to expose the truth and take action. The next day, Mark returned to the dealership, still disguised as Mike. He had witnessed the corruption the day before, but now he was more determined than ever to dig deeper. He needed to know just how far the dealership's dishonest practices went. The elderly couple's situation had left a bitter taste in his mouth, and he wasn't going to let it slide. As soon as he entered the dealership, he could feel the tension. The sales team was hustling around, their eyes constantly on the lookout for potential buyers. Mark walked past rows of shiny vehicles, each one looking pristine and welcoming. But beneath the glossy exterior, he knew there was something darker at play. Today, Mark decided to take a closer look at the sales process, so he approached another RV that caught his eye. He didn't want to raise any suspicion, so he kept a casual pace as he examined the vehicle's features. He was pretending to be interested, but in truth, he was watching every interaction around him, waiting for another sign of the dealership's manipulative tactics. It didn't take long before a salesman approached him. Mark recognized him from the previous day. His name was Greg, and he had been the one pushing the elderly couple toward the extra fees. "Good afternoon, sir," Greg said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Looking for something specific today?" Mark smiled back, playing the role of a curious buyer. "Just browsing. I'm interested in this RV. I heard it's one of your top sellers." Greg's eyes lit up. "Oh, you're in luck. This one has been flying off the lot. Great price, and it comes with all sorts of added features. You won't find a better deal anywhere else." Mark could hear the practiced pitch in Greg's voice, the kind of fast-talking, smooth salesmanship he had heard so many times before. But something felt wrong. The words were coming too easily, and Mark could tell that Greg was working overtime to make the sale. "Added features?" Mark asked, raising an eyebrow. "What kind of added features?" Greg's smile widened. "Well, we've got paint protection, of course. You'll want that to keep the van looking pristine for years. Plus, we offer an extended warranty to ensure you're covered for any repairs down the road. And don't forget the rust proofing. We're one of the few dealerships that offers that service." Mark nodded slowly, pretending to consider it. He had seen this kind of tactic before: add unnecessary services and inflating the price. But it wasn't just about the price, it was about the manipulation. He knew the dealership was preying on customers like the elderly couple, those who were less familiar with how car sales worked and who were being coerced into accepting inflated charges without fully understanding them. "So these services are optional?" Mark asked, carefully probing. Greg's eyes flickered, but he quickly recovered. "Oh, they're optional, of course," he said, though the tone in his voice made it clear that they were more than just a suggestion. "But believe me, you'll want them. Once you see the final price, you won't regret it." Mark suppressed a grimace. The pitch was smooth, but it was clear that Greg was counting on customers not doing their due diligence. And that's when it hit him. The dealership wasn't just practicing bad salesmanship. They were corrupt, adding fees that were unnecessary and pushing products that customers didn't need. Before Mark could continue questioning Greg, he overheard a familiar voice. The elderly couple from yesterday was standing nearby, discussing the RV they had looked at, clearly still unsure about the deal they were being pressured into. Mark stepped closer, pretending to be absorbed in the RV's features while listening to their conversation. The elderly woman was asking questions about the price, clearly concerned, but the salesman had already started glossing over her concerns. Mark could see the woman's confusion. She was being pushed into a deal that didn't feel right to her. "I just don't understand why the price keeps going up," she murmured to her husband. The husband, clearly more frustrated than before, replied, "I don't know, but they say these charges are necessary." Mark couldn't stand it anymore. He moved closer to the couple, taking a deep breath before speaking up. "Excuse me," Mark said, his voice friendly but firm. "I overheard your conversation, and I just wanted to say, those extra charges aren't really necessary. You should be able to walk away with just the cost of the RV and taxes, nothing more." The elderly couple turned to him, surprised but grateful for the tip. "You mean these charges aren't mandatory?" the husband asked. Mark shook his head. "No, they're not. That's just part of the sales pitch. I'm afraid some dealers add unnecessary fees to inflate the price and make you think you're getting a better deal than you are. But you should be able to negotiate the price without them." The couple looked at him, then back at the salesman, who was now clearly uncomfortable. Mark didn't want to stay too long, so he gave them a reassuring nod. "I just wanted to let you know," Mark said, "and I hope you make the best decision for yourselves." With that, he turned and walked toward the exit, his mind spinning. He knew he had seen enough. The corruption was deep, and the elderly couple wasn't the only one being taken advantage of. But the real challenge lay ahead. It wasn't enough to just warn them. Mark had to take action, and he knew that was exactly what he was going to do. Mark couldn't shake the image of the elderly couple as he drove away from the dealership. The look of confusion and frustration on their faces had stayed with him. He had known something wasn't right, but now, after what he had witnessed firsthand, he couldn't ignore the depth of the corruption any longer. This wasn't just about bad sales tactics. It was about people being taken advantage of, and Mark wasn't going to stand by and let it continue. He knew what he had to do. Mark couldn't just be an observer anymore. He was the CEO of this dealership, and if the employees and customers were going to trust him, he needed to act. But it wasn't going to be easy. The system was deeply ingrained, and he knew the people responsible would not take kindly to his interference. The next morning, Mark returned to the dealership. But this time, he wasn't pretending to be a regular customer. He was the CEO, no disguise, no fake identity. He walked into the dealership with his head held high, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. As soon as he entered, the usual chaos of the sales floor went quiet. Salesmen froze mid-conversation, their eyes wide as they realized who had just walked in. Greg, the salesman who had been talking to him the day before, looked as though he'd seen a ghost. Mark didn't waste time. He made a beeline for Greg's desk, and the salesman quickly stood, his demeanor shifting from cocky to nervous in an instant. "Mr. Mark, what brings you in today?" Greg stammered, trying to hide his discomfort. "I'm here to talk to you about your practices, Greg," Mark replied, his voice steady but firm. "And I think we should have this conversation in front of the team." Greg's face paled, and he hesitated. But Mark didn't wait for a response. He walked to the center of the sales floor and called for the employees to gather. One by one, they filtered in, their expressions ranging from curious to uneasy. Mark could sense the tension in the room. The dealership was on edge, and for good reason. When everyone had gathered, Mark took a deep breath and addressed the room. "I've been undercover in this dealership for the past few days," he began, his voice clear and strong. "And what I've seen is unacceptable. I've seen the way customers are being treated, specifically the elderly couple I spoke with yesterday. They were being pressured into paying fees that weren't necessary. This kind of behavior is not something I will tolerate in my company." There was an uneasy murmur among the employees, and Mark could see some of them shifting uncomfortably. But he didn't back down. "I want to make it clear," he continued, "that from this moment on, things will change. No more hidden fees, no more manipulating customers into unnecessary services. We will be transparent with our pricing, and we will treat every customer with respect." Greg opened his mouth to protest, but Mark held up a hand to silence him. "I'm not finished, Greg. I've also heard about the pressure you've been placing on your team. I've seen the way you treat your colleagues, the way you push them to meet impossible sales quotas, without any regard for their well-being. That ends today." The room went silent. Mark's eyes swept over the faces of the sales team. Some looked relieved, while others appeared nervous about what was coming next. "I'm here to tell you that this dealership is going to change," Mark said, his voice filled with authority. "We will no longer focus on short-term profits at the expense of our employees and customers. We will create an environment where people feel valued, both the customers who walk through the door and the employees who work here." Mark paused, letting the weight of his words settle in. He turned to Greg, who was standing with his arms crossed, a scowl on his face. "You're fired, Greg," Mark said firmly. Greg's eyes widened in disbelief. "You can't do this," he protested. But Mark was unmoved. "I can, and I just did," Mark replied. "You've created a toxic environment here, and I won't let that continue. You've manipulated customers and disrespected your team. This ends now." Greg sputtered, but there was no use in arguing. Mark had already made up his mind. Security escorted Greg off the premises as the rest of the sales team watched in stunned silence. With Greg gone, Mark turned to the rest of the team. "I know this is a shock, but I want you to know that this is just the beginning. We'll be working together to rebuild the trust of our customers. I'm putting in place new systems for transparency, fairness, and accountability." Mark took a deep breath and smiled, his confidence returning. "And for the employees who have been working hard, those who have been treated poorly, those who have been pressured into doing things they weren't comfortable with, things are going to change. I'm going to make sure you're supported." The room began to relax. People were starting to see that Mark wasn't just talking, he was acting. The sense of relief was palpable. "I'm also going to meet with each of you personally to talk about what you need to succeed," Mark added. "We will work together to create an environment where we all thrive." As the employees began to disperse, Mark knew this was only the beginning of a much larger transformation. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. But it was happening. Mark stepped outside, taking a moment to collect his thoughts. He had done what needed to be done. The dealership was on the path to recovery, but the real work was just starting. The following weeks were filled with change, and Mark knew he had a long road ahead of him. The dealership had been a well-oiled machine, but it was one built on deception, manipulation, and pressure. Now, Mark was tasked with turning things around. He couldn't just get rid of the bad apples and move on. He needed to rebuild trust, both with his employees and with the customers they served. The first step was to establish a new set of core values. Mark called in his team for a meeting where he outlined his vision for the future. "We're no longer just a dealership. We're a business that values integrity, transparency, and respect," Mark began, his voice firm. "Our focus will shift from high-pressure sales to providing real value for our customers." He could see the skepticism in some of the faces around the room. Employees had been trained to push hard, to sell at any cost. But Mark was clear. Things were going to be different. He wanted to make sure every employee understood the changes, and most importantly, he wanted them to understand why these changes mattered. He spent hours working with his team, explaining the new protocols. A more customer-centric sales process, transparent pricing with no hidden fees, and an open-door policy for employees to voice their concerns. For the first time, Mark could sense the shift. Some were still hesitant, but many were relieved. They didn't want to pressure customers, they didn't want to be treated unfairly, and they didn't want to feel as though their only worth was based on how many cars they could sell. Mark knew he needed to lead by example. He didn't just want his employees to follow the new rules, he wanted them to believe in them. He spent the next few weeks working side by side with the sales team, attending meetings and talking to customers, ensuring that they knew the new direction was for real. The feedback from customers who had been aware of the dealership's shady practices was cautiously optimistic. People were starting to believe they could trust this place again. However, the hardest part was yet to come. Mark knew that to truly rebuild trust, he had to fix the culture within the dealership. He couldn't just fire one bad manager and expect everything to change. He needed to hold everyone accountable. That meant putting real processes in place to measure performance, not just in sales numbers, but in customer satisfaction and employee well-being. One of the first people he hired to help with this was Maria, the new operations manager. She had come highly recommended and was an expert in business culture. Mark knew that with her help, he could rebuild the dealership's internal structure from the ground up. Maria immediately got to work, implementing new training programs for the staff, creating incentives for good customer service, and ensuring that each employee had a clear path for advancement. But even with Maria's help, change wasn't instant. Mark could feel the pushback from some of the veteran employees who had grown comfortable with the old way of doing things. They were used to the chaos, the door deals, and the short-term profits. They didn't trust Mark's new vision. One day, while walking through the dealership, Mark noticed one of the salesmen, Jake, whispering to a colleague. Mark had been keeping an eye on him for some time. Jake had been with the dealership for years and had thrived under the old system, using shady tactics to close deals. Mark decided it was time for a conversation. He approached Jake at his desk, where the salesman was busy going over his latest sales targets. "Jake," Mark said, his tone neutral but firm, "can we talk for a minute?" Jake looked up, a smile fading from his face. "Of course, Mr. Mark. What's up?" "I've been hearing things," Mark started, his gaze steady. "I know change is hard, but I need you to understand, this new direction is non-negotiable. If you can't get behind it, it might be time for us to part ways." Jake stiffened, clearly caught off guard. "I'm doing my job, Mr. Mark. I've been closing sales, meeting the targets you set." "What's the problem?" The problem is that you're still working like we did before, pushing customers into bad deals, applying pressure tactics, and hiding fees. That's not how we do things anymore, Mark replied, his voice unwavering. Jake's expression faltered, and for a moment, Mark saw a glimpse of vulnerability in his eyes. He wasn't used to being called out for his methods. I didn't think it was a big deal, Jake muttered. Mark shook his head. It's a big deal, Jake. Customers trust us, and it's my job to make sure we earn that trust every single day. If you can't do that, I can't have you here. There was a long silence as Jake stared at the floor. Finally, he nodded, defeated. I get it. I'll change. Mark smiled, offering a hand. I'm not asking you to be perfect, Jake, but I need you to be honest with the customers. Help them make the best decision for them. That's how we're going to succeed. The next few days were a test of Mark's new leadership. It was easy to make promises, but harder to turn those promises into lasting change. But with every small victory, Mark saw the dealership slowly begin to transform. The employees were starting to buy into the new culture. The customers were starting to trust them again. And most importantly, Mark could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The fear, the tension, and the dishonesty were slowly being replaced by a sense of pride and purpose. But Mark knew there was still a long road ahead. He had made progress, but the journey of rebuilding trust, inside and outside the dealership, was only just beginning. Mark knew that the time had come to bring everything to light. The issues at the dealership weren't just about one corrupt sales manager, Greg, or a few bad apples. It was systemic, and it had to be fixed at its core. After his undercover work, Mark was determined to ensure that customers were treated with the respect they deserved. Especially the elderly couple he had encountered earlier, who had been misled by hidden fees and dishonest practices. It had been several days since he first confronted Greg, and Mark had been monitoring the changes closely. He had fired Greg immediately after the conversation in the office, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that a simple managerial change wouldn't be enough to turn things around. He needed to rebuild trust with the customers and make the entire dealership accountable for its actions. Mark had learned from the elderly couple's experience, and it had been a wake-up call. They had been so trusting, not understanding the true cost of the vehicle due to the inflated charges and lack of transparency. They weren't the only ones. His dealership had been systematically overcharging and misleading customers, and it was time to stop it. As Mark arrived at the dealership that day, he felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. The workers were getting used to the changes, but Mark knew he had to lead by example and create an environment of honesty and transparency. He walked into the showroom, where a few salespeople were chatting among themselves. When they saw him, they immediately stopped talking and looked at him expectantly. Mark stood in front of them and, for the first time, addressed the entire staff directly. "Everyone, gather around," Mark said, his voice commanding but not harsh. The staff gathered in front of him, and Mark took a deep breath before continuing. "As many of you know, we've had a serious problem here at the dealership. It's not just about sales numbers. It's about trust. It's about how we treat our customers. And we failed them. We failed the elderly couple who were misled with hidden fees and dishonest charges. And we failed to be transparent with our customers who simply wanted to buy a vehicle." The room was silent, but Mark could feel the tension in the air. The employees had seen what had been happening but were too afraid to speak up. "I fired Greg, but I won't stop there," Mark continued. "I'm committed to changing the culture here. This dealership will no longer be a place where customers are overcharged, lied to, or made to feel like they're just another transaction. We are going to offer fair prices, honest deals, and transparency in everything we do." He paused, looking each employee in the eye. "I will be implementing a new set of policies, and I will be here, checking in regularly. I need all of you to be on board with this. There will be no more hidden fees, no more shady practices. If you don't agree with this, then you don't belong here." The employees exchanged glances, a sense of relief starting to spread across the room. Mark had their attention, and they could see that he was serious about turning the dealership around. "Starting today, we are going to make things right. We'll begin by revising our pricing structure. All hidden fees will be clearly listed, and I'll personally ensure that our customers understand everything before they sign any agreements. We'll also implement a refund policy for any customer who feels they were misled in the past." The staff looked at one another, a sense of optimism starting to replace the skepticism. Mark wasn't finished yet. "Next, we are going to reach out to that elderly couple," Mark said, his voice softer now, but filled with sincerity. "I want to apologize to them personally. They deserve it, and we owe them that much." He walked over to the desk and picked up the phone, dialing the number of the elderly couple. The phone rang for a few moments before a voice on the other end answered. "Hello?" the elderly man said. "Hi, Mr. Miller. This is Mark from the dealership," Mark said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I wanted to personally apologize for the treatment you received here. We've had some serious issues with how things were being handled, and I'm making changes to ensure this doesn't happen again. You were misled, and that's not right. I want to make it up to you." The elderly man hesitated, clearly surprised, before replying. I appreciate you calling. It's been tough for us, honestly. We just wanted to buy an RV, not feel like we were taken advantage of." "I understand, Mr. Miller," Mark said, feeling the weight of his words. "I will make sure we rectify the situation and that this doesn't happen again. I'll also personally make sure you get the RV you wanted, with no extra charges or hidden fees. In fact, as an apology for the trouble, I'd like to offer you a 15% discount on your purchase. We owe you that much." The elderly man's voice softened. "Thank you, son. We weren't sure if anyone would care." "I do, Mr. Miller," Mark replied. "I care a lot, and I'm making sure that this dealership will do better from now on." After hanging up the phone, Mark turned to the staff. "That's how we do business from now on. We put people first. The customers aren't just numbers to us. They are people with lives, families, and dreams. Our job is to help them, not take advantage of them." The staff nodded, some of them even smiling. Mark knew that they were beginning to see the bigger picture. He had started something that day, something that would take time to rebuild, but he was confident that it was the right path forward. As Mark left the dealership that evening, he felt a sense of peace. It wasn't over yet, but the change had begun. The road ahead would be difficult, but he knew one thing for sure. Honesty, integrity, and respect would guide him from here on out. And as for the elderly couple, they would have the fair deal they deserved, and Mark would make sure of it.